Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar to talk about the Code of Conduct for Aged Care. My name is Janet Anderson. I'm the Commissioner of the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the custodians of the lands on which we're meeting around Australia, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also to extend those respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today for the webinar. To state the obvious, and something that we're all very familiar with, the Australian government's reform agenda is definitely gathering pace. And I know everyone on this webinar representing providers is working hard to understand and adapt to the changing and changed requirements, in parallel with your ongoing attention to ensuring that you are well placed to deal with the pandemic. I absolutely want to assure you that the Commission I lead is committed to supporting you to understand and to implement the new obligations relating to the reforms. Now, many of you have attended our introductory webinars, which we held last month on the national health reforms from a regulatory perspective, and those recordings are available on our website if you happen to have missed them or you want to see them again. Today, we're going to take a deeper dive into the Code of Conduct for Aged Care, which we'll call the Code, or possibly sometimes even Code. This is the first of two webinars we're hosting on the Code of Conduct as part of our reform series. And the next one is scheduled to take place on the 11th of November. That will be specifically for aged care workers. So I'll remind you about that again before we finish. To state the obvious, all of us have a really important role to play in ensuring the successful implementation of the aged care reforms as a whole. So your attendance today indicates that you're interested in learning more about the code, which is going to come into effect from the 1st of December this year. So good on you for giving this your time and attention. The aim of the code is to improve the safety, health, well-being and quality of life for people receiving aged care and to boost trust in aged care services. It will apply to approved providers, governing persons such as CEOs and board members, and aged care workers. It's included in a piece of legislation which was recently passed, which goes by the name of the Royal Commission Response Act, which is an amending piece of legislation, which included 9 measures, all of which related to recommendations by the Royal Commission. And one of the measures is the new Code of Conduct for Aged Care. So as you'll hear today, the responsibilities under the new code are consistent with your existing obligations under the Aged Care Act, including the Aged Care Quality Standards. So this is not introducing something new and special and different. It should be relatively familiar territory to you because you're an aged care provider and you operate under an existing legislative framework. What we're going to cover today includes each provider's responsibilities to comply with the code and to take reasonable steps to ensure that your governing persons and aged care workers also comply with the code. When it comes into effect from 1st of December, we in the Commission will be responsible for overseeing compliance with the code, and you'll learn more about that in this webinar. Last Friday, the Department of Health and Aged Care released what they call an exposure draft, which includes a copy of the code. It's now available for public review, and you can certainly access it from the Department of Health and Aged Care website. So if you haven't already looked at it, I strongly recommend that you do. Now, in today's webinar, as the slide says, we're going to provide you with an overview of the code, talk about your responsibilities and those of your governing persons and workers, how you prepare yourself for implementation, and the steps you can take specifically to ensure that your workforce is ready. We'll also explain the Commission's role and how we will support you and your workers and indeed older Australians receiving aged care in the lead up to 1st of December. I'm joined today by 3 people on a panel, all of whom have important information to share with you. The first is Katie Home, and Katie works in the Department of Health and Aged Care, and she's going to talk about the policy intent of the code. Michelle Bampton from the Commission will be talking about what the code means for providers, governing persons and workers and how you can get yourself ready. And the panel is rounded out by a presentation from Lisa Peterson from the Commission, who will talk about the legislation and the Commission's role and how we will regulate the code. Now, some of you have taken the opportunity of submitting questions prior to this session. Thank you very much for that. You also have the opportunity of submitting questions during the session. Take full advantage of that opportunity. We will field as many of those questions as we can at the end of the panelist presentation. We have allowed time to go to your questions, so there will be a Q&A session, but any we don't get to, we will actually publish online with an answer to them, and we'll make sure that that is available to you as soon as possible after the webinar. So without further ado, let us go to the first panelist, Katie Home. And Katie, as I said, is from the Department of Health and Aged Care, and she's going to be talking to us about the policy intent of the code. Thanks, Katie.
And good afternoon, delegates. As the Commissioner mentioned, an exposure draft of the code, the subordinate legislation for the code, as well as the code consultation summary report are now available on the department's website. The code applies to approved providers as well as current and previous aged care workers and governing persons from the date of commencement on the 1st of December. The code sets out standards of behaviours for approved providers, their aged care workers and their governing persons to ensure that services are delivered to older Australians in a safe, competent and respectful manner. The intent of the code is not to create new obligations, as the code requirements are consistent with existing obligations that workers are already expected to meet. And the Commissioner just mentioned that in her introduction. But rather, the policy intent is to protect older Australians by ensuring they receive suitable standards of care and ensuring there are consequences for people who don't act appropriately. So through the consultation that we conducted, stakeholders broadly supported the requirements for providers, governing persons and aged care workers to comply with the code. Stakeholders also told us that it was appropriate to draw on the NDIS Code of Conduct as the basis for the Code of Conduct for aged care. When the code takes effect on 1 December, it will apply to approved providers, their aged care workers and their governing persons. Under the Aged Care Act, this includes residential aged care, the Home Care Packages Program, short-term restorative care, the Transition Care Program and Multi-Purpose Services Program. Providers delivering Commonwealth Home Support Program and the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Flexible Aged Care Program are not approved providers under the Aged Care Act. And because of that, obligations regarding compliance with the code don't apply to CHSP or NATSI FAC or their aged care workers at this point in time. Now, given the direction of the reforms, I think it can be safely anticipated that similar provisions to the code will be extended to all Commonwealth-funded aged care services as part of the introduction of the new Aged Care Act. In terms of the policy intent of protecting older Australians, what this reform does is ensures that there are consequences for those occasions where there is poor conduct. The Commission will be able to take action with regard to compliance with the code, as well as enforcement action for substantiated breaches. Introduced into the reform is the concept of banning orders, and they will apply in only the most serious cases. So the Code of Conduct and banning orders will apply to current and previous aged care workers and governing persons. As I mentioned, banning orders are considered the Commission's most serious enforcement action in relation to an individual, and it would therefore be anticipated it would only be appropriate for the most serious cases of poor conduct. I'm happy now to move to my colleague in the Commission, Michelle Brampton.
Just before we do, thank you, Katie. Well done. just as a bridge, if you like, I'll just reiterate that as I mentioned before, this is the first of 2 webinars we're going to hold on the Code of Conduct. Registrations for the November webinar will open 1 week before the event, so please keep an eye out on our Reforms webpage on the Commission website for the registration link so that you can share it with your workforce. Okay, let's now move to the next panellist, Michelle. Michelle is a senior member of Commission staff, and she's going to give us an overview of the code, what it means for you, your governing persons and workers, and how to prepare yourself for the go live from the beginning of December. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Janet. Hello, everyone. Lovely to be with you again today for those who attended the previous webinars. I'm going to give you a little bit of a recap on some of what you've heard already, just to set the scene, and then move on to talk about the actual detail of the code. I think I can do slides at the same time, or perhaps not, as it turns out. As the Commission has highlighted, the new Code of Conduct for Aged Care will be introduced from the 1st of December with the purpose of improving the safety, health, well-being and quality of life for people receiving aged care services. And very much the intent of the code as well to boost the trust, the public trust and consumer trust in those services. The code sets out the standards of expected behaviours that apply equally to aged care providers, their governing persons, and by governing persons we mean people like CEOs and board members, and also aged care workers. Let me see if I can get onto the right slide. Sorry, it's a little bit clunky with everything on the one screen. By aged care workers, we are talking about the people employed by an approved provider, and that includes volunteers, and also people employed by any contractors or subcontractors of the provider, and that also includes volunteers as well. So in terms of service types that the code applies to, you heard Katie mention that it applies to residential care, home care services and flexible care services, and that includes transition care program, the multi-purpose services and the short-term restorative care program. As Katie also said, the code at this stage won't apply to the Commonwealth Home Support Program or the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Flexible Aged Care Program, maybe in the future, but not at this stage. And the Commission's role, which you'll hear more about from Lisa Peterson going forwards, is really to regulate the providers, the governing persons and the aged care workers' compliance with the code. And as we always do, we'll be using a risk-based and proportionate regulatory approach to this. And as I say, Lisa will talk more about that later on. I'm going to talk now about the actual elements of the code. And as people have mentioned, you can find these in the exposure draft on the Department of Health and Aged Care's website. If I move to the next slide, which will take my presentation off. There we go. So the code consists of 8 elements and describes the kind of behaviours that consumers can expect from those providing their care, their supports and their services. So the code requires approved providers, governing persons and aged care workers to do a range of things, to act in particular ways. And element A talks about them acting with respect for people's rights to freedom of expression, self-determination and decision-making in accordance with applicable laws and conventions. Element B talks about acting in a way that treats people with dignity and respect and values diversity. And element C is really talking about acting with respect for people's privacy. Element D is around aged care providers, governing persons and workers providing care and supports and services in a safe and competent manner and with care and skill. And you'll start to see the familiarity there with some of the language and the concepts that are already familiar to you in the aged care standards, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Let me try moving the slide again for you. There we go. And so element E is talking about aged care providers, workers and governing persons acting with integrity, honesty and transparency. Element F, requiring people to promptly take steps to raise and act on concerns about matters that may impact the quality and safety of care, supports and services. And elements G and H really talking about the importance of providing care, supports and services free from all forms of violence, discrimination, exploitation, neglect and abuse and sexual misconduct. And element H takes that a step further and talking about taking all reasonable steps to prevent and respond to all forms of violence, discrimination, exploitation, neglect, abuse and sexual misconduct. So these elements of the code are consistent with existing requirements for providers, but also consistent with community expectations, with consumer expectations and with the existing aged care standards as well. Another thing that the code is consistent with is the National Disability Insurance Scheme Code of Conduct. And for providers providing services in that space, you'll be familiar with that code. This code is the Code of Conduct for Aged Care is very much based on the NDIS code, but also on feedback, as you heard from Katie, from the public consultations undertaken by the Department of Health in late 2021. So there are some differences which came out in some of those consultations where the aged care sector wanted some slightly different things. And those minor differences are things around element B has been added to the aged care code, which requires approved providers, governing persons and aged care workers to act in a way that treats people with dignity and respect and values their diversity. And of course, concepts of dignity and respect are fundamental and featured strongly in the consultations and already embedded in the aged care quality standards and the Charter of Resident Rights. Element G has been added to the aged care code, that is to provide care, supports and services free from all forms of violence, discrimination, exploitation, neglect and abuse. And this recognises the importance of ensuring that steps are taken to prevent and respond, but also that care is actually provided in a way that is free from those things like violence, discrimination, exploitation, neglect and abuse. So for clarity, the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission will continue to regulate its code, and the Code of Conduct for Aged Care, as you've heard today, will be regulated by us in the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission. Importantly though, the responsibilities for providers, governing persons and workers across both sectors are, and what consumers can expect from that behaviour is substantially the same. Both codes have a really strong and appropriate focus on an individual's rights to receive safe and quality services and to have confidence in the workforce, and not only to feel protected, but to actually be protected. So if you're delivering services in an aged care setting, the Code of Conduct for Aged Care applies, and as you've heard, that applies to workers, approved providers and the governing persons. The NDIS Commission can provide more information around where the NDIS code applies, and there's lots of information available on that in their website. And we're obviously working closely with them as we work to implement the Code of Conduct for Aged Care, make sure that providers understand responsibilities in both areas. Speaking of provider responsibilities, I wanted to talk a little bit more about that. The responsibilities of providers under the code, as I've mentioned, are consistent with those obligations that you already comply with under the Aged Care Act, the Quality Standards and the Charter of Aged Care Rights. The quality standards include common concepts used throughout the code, including affording consumers dignity and respect, responding to feedback and complaints, and ensuring the delivery of safe and competent care. The Charter of Aged Care Rights sets out the 14 rights for consumers, and some elements of the code reflect the same language in the Charter in describing how consumers are expected to be treated by providers, workers and governing persons. The quality of care principles describe the systems and processes that providers must have in place to prevent, respond to, and manage incidents that occur in care delivery. And these responsibilities complement the elements of the code that require those providing care to prevent, respond, and take reasonable actions to address certain harms, such as that discrimination, abuse, and violence that I talked about earlier. So each of these existing measures intersect with the code and are aimed at ensuring consumers are treated well and with dignity. But there's one new responsibility for providers under the code, and that is that providers need to take reasonable steps to ensure that their workers and governing persons comply with the code. So that's a new responsibility for providers. And reasonable steps include ensuring that governing persons and aged care workers do understand the code and are able to act in that way consistent with the code within their work. And some of the things that we would consider to be reasonable steps would include things like reading and understanding the code and the relevant guidance that's associated with it. We are in the process of developing and publishing guidance for aged care workers and governing persons, also for providers and also for consumers. And so the guidance for providers is actually available now on our website, and I'd encourage you to have a look at that. But reading and understanding the code and the relevant guidance is something that would be a reasonable step that we would expect a provider to take in making sure that their workers and governing persons comply with the code. Also, things like undergoing regular training and professional development that helps them understand and apply the code and uphold the behaviours expected under the code. Help making sure that workers understand the consequences of not complying with the code, both for the provider and for them personally. We'd also expect providers to support their workers to resolve issues and concerns where there are concerns identified with their compliance with the code, and for example through training or guidance or supervision, so that they build their skills and capability to be able to comply with the code. So as I mentioned, we've just published some draft guidance on our website for providers with versions to follow for governing persons, workers and consumers. And I'd encourage you to review those resources, and they'll provide more information about the elements of the code, how you can prepare for implementing the code, and detailed information about the code elements themselves. So leading up to and beyond the 1st of December, we'll continue to support you and your workforce in relation to the code, and that includes sharing things like online resources, the guidance materials. We'll have fact sheets, videos and posters available, a readiness checklist with scenarios and a web-based quiz, online learning programs through our free aged care learning information solution known as Alice. There'll be some learning programs there specifically targeted towards code, and further webinars, as Janet mentioned, on the key reform measures, including a webinar coming up around code. Just a word, I know that we saw in some of the questions coming in, people are asking about mandatory training. We're not planning mandatory training for providers, governing persons and workers at this stage in relation to the Code of Conduct for Aged Care, and that's because the code requirements are consistent with the existing obligations, as I've spoken about, under the Act and the quality standards. So we feel that most people will be familiar with these and are already complying, so we're not planning mandatory training as such. Regular updates from both the Commission and the Department of Health and Aged Care will also be provided, and we've got a fantastic reforms webpage that I'd certainly recommend to you, Keeping Up with Reforms Central, really good resource there, and anything new information as it comes out will be linked to that page. So I'll hand back to you, Janet. Thanks very much, everyone.
Well done, Michelle. Thank you very much. Just before I hand over to our last panellist, I want to draw your attention to the yellow speech bubble icon at the top of your screen, We're very keen to get your feedback on our webinars, so that, because we're on a continuous improvement journey, just as you are, and we're very happy to receive commentary on how we've done, where you think we can improve, or where you think that we have marked. So please use that icon, press that icon now, or even at the end of the webinar when you've reached a view, and complete the survey at the end of that icon link. It won't take you terribly long, and it does give us very direct feedback on how we're travelling and how we can improve our products as we go. Another reminder also, thank you for those of you who submitted questions so far. Keep them coming. Use the function that's available to you to send your questions through. There will be an opportunity to answer as many of them as we can when we complete the panelist presentation. So, to the final panelist, Lisa Peterson, Assistant Commissioner in the Commission. And Lisa's going to touch on the legislation that I did refer to initially, but more importantly, spend a bit of time talking to you about the Commission's role and giving us some details on how we, the regulator, will regulate the code. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks very much, Janet, and hi everybody. Thanks so much for joining us for the session this afternoon. It's great to be here. I'm going to kick off by sharing a little bit of general information about the legislative framework for the code that sets out the role for the Commission, and then talk a little bit about how we will be regulating the code. So as we heard from Katie, we already have what we call primary legislation, which is the Royal Commission Response Act 2022, and that was passed by the Parliament in August of this year. And that sets out the high-level arrangements for the code. So this act included new provisions that allowed for the creation of a code of conduct for aged care, and it explains how the code applies to aged care providers, governing persons and aged care workers. And the Act gives the Commission particular powers to monitor and enforce compliance with the code, including issuing civil penalties if providers, governing persons or workers don't meet the code. And in the most serious circumstances, as Katie's mentioned, the Commission also has the power to ban workers or governing persons from working in aged care, and to also publish a public register of each person who has a banning order against them. Now, as you've heard already, this is intended for the most serious offences, so we don't contemplate using this power terribly often, but it's very important that people understand that it's part of the suite of measures that we can take. The legislation also includes some natural justice steps, so that's to ensure that providers or individuals, of course, have the chance to respond before serious decisions are made, including issuing a banning order. So that means that there'll be avenues for internal and external appeals. So that's the first tier of legislation. And there's additional legislation which sits under the Act, as again Katie mentioned, called the subordinate legislation. And this is called the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission Amendment, Code of Conduct and Banning Orders Rules 2022. And these rules really provide the detail on how the code will work and who it applies to and our role and powers. So as you've heard, that's available to you on the Department of Health and Aged Care website. It's open for public consultation, I think, until the 18th of October. And you can find it by going to the Department of Health and Aged Care's Ageing and Aged Care Engagement Hub. So that's the sort of legal framework. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about how we're going to regulate the code in practice and how the process can work. So the first thing to say here is that there are a number of different ways that the Commission can receive or become aware of information about possible non-compliance with the code. And it's really important to remember that the Commission already receives and responds to information in relation to worker conduct through our complaints function and also through reportable incident notifications. So in that context, information in relation to the code will come to us again through complaints we receive, perhaps by information that might be obtained during a site visit where we might be undertaking a reaccreditation audit. It could be a notification under the Serious Incident Response Scheme, or somebody making contact with us through our customer contact centre. And in terms of how we respond to the information, we have a range of different options. In some circumstances, we might record the concerns but take no immediate action. And that's most likely where the Commission already has enough information to determine that the provider's already responded appropriately, or perhaps we assess that the matter is low risk. We can discuss information with relevant people. So we might get in contact with the provider, the aged care worker, a governing person, perhaps a consumer. It might be a consumer's representative or the person that made a complaint. And we can provide education about provider responsibilities or educate a particular individual about their responsibility under the code when that's required. We might request or require a provider or another person to give the Commission information or documents. And we could also ask the provider to take a specified action. So, for example, we might require a provider to ensure that a worker doesn't work unsupervised while a particular matter is being looked into. We could also undertake an investigation, and this will happen where we don't have evidence that confirms non-compliance with the code, but where the serious nature of the conduct issues raised and the apparent or potential harm to consumers causes us significant concerns. So that's when we'll have a deeper look. At any time, we can refer or share information with another responsible body. So that could be the police, the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency, or the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission. And again, for those most serious cases, we may issue a banning order to an aged care worker or a governing person, which can prohibit or restrict them from being involved in or engaged in aged care. As we've said, I want to emphasise the point again, banning orders are considered to be the Commission's most serious enforcement action in relation to individuals and therefore only appropriate for those most serious cases of poor conduct. The Commission also has the power to issue a banning order for a person who has not previously been involved in as an aged care worker or a governing person. So, for example, a banning order may be made where the Commission reasonably believes that an individual is not suitable to be involved in the provision of aged care. So, for example, where that individual might have been convicted of an indictable offence or where there is an NDIS banning order in force. The Commission can also issue an infringement notice to a provider or a worker. And in those circumstances, the provider or worker will be required to make a payment to the Commonwealth unless they elect to challenge that process in court. And as with all of its regulatory activities, we will here at the Commission take a risk-based and proportionate approach to dealing with code matters. And that means that our regulatory response or the action that we take is going to be determined based on what we see as the level of risk to aged care consumers, but also the likelihood of the provider to manage that risk. So the greater the level of risk, the more intensive our engagement is going to be with the provider. As I mentioned earlier, the legislation also includes protections that ensure providers and individuals are given the chance to respond to allegations before serious decisions are made. So there are avenues for internal and external appeals in relation to banning orders and code of conduct compliance notices. The reconsideration arrangements for existing reviewable decisions continue to apply, and we'll include details of these arrangements in our regulatory bulletin on reconsideration decisions. We'll also have a process in place where people can correct any incorrect information that's published on the banning register. So just to finish, I want to remind you that the information that we're giving you today is based on the content from the draft subordinate legislation. And because we've got that consultation process underway, it's possible that there could be some changes. So Michelle gave you the top tip. Please keep an eye on our aged care reform page, where we'll be sure to update you if there are any questions. That's all from me. Thanks very much, Janet.
All right. Well done, panellists. Thank you all. Now it's your turn. People watching, submitting questions either before today's webinar or during the webinar, and I've got some really good ones. Katie, a few for you first, and I'll give them to you one at a time to give you a chance to answer each of them. I want to start with a question which I think is a really good one. Somebody's asking, and they have knowledge that the government is moving the in-home services sector to this new model called supported home. And in consideration of that, the question is, why does the code not apply to Commonwealth Home Support Program providers, and will it apply later? Katie.
Simple answer to that question is that the way the legislation has been drafted the scope of that in the first instance is to capture approved providers. And I explained who make up that category, and I've also explained the exclusions. So there is anticipation that with the other reforms that will unfold in the next 12 to 24 months, principally around the development of New Aged Care Act, the way the concept of approved providers will be re-looked at in that process. So as part of that process, it's envisaged that there will be a much wider scope, an all-encompassing scope for coverage for instruments such as the Code of Conduct. So it's not there yet, but the very strong signal is that that would be the direction that would be all-encompassing, subject, of course, to the government confirming that that's the direction that they want to go in.
Okay. There's a supplementary question, if I may, for you, Katie. The Inquirer understands that CHSP providers are out of scope for the moment, but this particular provider is also subcontracted to deliver home care package services, and they're just wondering what their situation would be. Are you in a position to provide general guidance on that?
I think I could, Commissioner, in the sense that if the question relates to that they're a subcontractor, so that the code is intended to be encompassing of all workers, all key personnel, and in fact the provider itself as well. Now, if you are working in one field, like the home care packages program, then that would be covered. So you could in fact be undertaking work and code covered in one capacity, but not technically covered in another service type, NATSI-FAC, for example, or CHSP. But as the discussion has outlined today, these requirements are fairly standard and consistent with other obligations that providers have to meet. So it shouldn't be a practical problem. In fact, it would be a positive that you're already complying with the code with one service type hat on while you're undertaking that work.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Michelle, I have a question for you. And a few people have asked this in different ways. Do all staff have to sign the Code of Conduct?
Thanks, Janet. Look, there's no requirement in the legislation for staff to sign off on the Code of Conduct. So there's flexibility for aged care providers there to have different requirements for their staff and different ways that suit their environment for how they go about making sure that their workers and governing persons are familiar with the code and complying with the code. So, for example, providers may require their staff to sign off that they'll comply with the code as part of their employment relationship. Others may take a different approach, but there's that flexibility in the current arrangements.
Okay. Staying with you, you mentioned in your presentation that there was no mandatory worker training. Can you just take us back through that? Because there are some people online who also provide NDIS services and they're familiar with the arrangement which applied in NDIS. I think you were drawing a distinction.
Yeah, so there won't be mandatory training for the Code of Conduct in aged care, but I understand there is mandatory training for the NDIS code. And the reason that we are not requiring mandatory training as such is really that the requirements under the code for the aged care code are consistent with the obligations that providers already have. To be providing aged care services, you need to be meeting a range of responsibilities under the Act, including the aged care standards and the Charter of Rights. And so the code is completely consistent with what is required already under those existing requirements for providers. And so we didn't want to mandate training for something that is actually already a part of aged care workers and governing persons every day. And so there's not mandatory training planned in the same way as the NDIS, but there will be a range of educational information available, including the Alice online learning module, videos, fact sheets, all of those things available for providers to utilise to get their teams across the code for aged care if they want to use them that way.
Supplementary question for you, Michelle, if I may. You spoke also about the obligation of providers and the reasonable effort, which you also touched on in the answer you just gave. Can you just take us back through that briefly? Because there are aged care workers who are in scope, there are governing persons, and then there is this obligation which attaches to the approved provider. Just can you step us through that briefly again, please?
Sure, yeah. So the providers do have a new responsibility under the code, and that new responsibility is that they take reasonable steps to ensure that their workers and governing persons comply with the code. And by reasonable steps, the reasonable steps include things like ensuring that governing persons and aged care workers read and understand the code of conduct for aged care and the relevant guidance material. And I mentioned at that stage the code of conduct guidance that we've just published for providers, which is available on our website now. So I think that's a good way for people to start to understand more about what reasonable steps mean.
Okay, good, thank you. And that's actually a draft document. I'm aware that we may do some further refinements,
Sure.
but we were so keen to make it available to people as early as we could that we decided to go with the draft. And we'll just encourage you to keep a close eye on the website, all of you online, to make sure that you pick up the final version as soon as it becomes available. And we'll certainly be doing our best to publish it or publicise its availability as soon as we can put it together. As a few people have now mentioned, Katie and Lisa, the exposure draft of the actual code is available for public comment, and it won't be until that period is closed that the instrument is actually finalised and is able to be enforced, as it were. So we're in the final stages of the clarification and finalisation of the various instruments, but that should not be stopping any of you from doing the preparatory work that has been outlined by, among others, by Lisa. So with that, I will now go to Lisa. Lisa, I have a couple of questions for you as well. As an employer, how can we check who has been banned from working in aged care?
Thanks very much, Janet. There will be a register of banning orders that's published by the Commission on our website once the code commences. So what we'd expect is that providers then, as part of their normal process of recruiting and onboarding new staff, will check that website.
Okay, thank you. Another question, and this is a very specific one, but I think it's worth putting to you. Will workers named in previous mandatory reporting to the Commission as proven perpetrators of abuse against older Australians be subjected to banning orders?
Yeah, thank you, Janet. Look, it's a really good question. The Code of Conduct provisions commence from 1 December 2022, and they don't operate retrospectively. So what that means is if there was conduct that happened prior to that date, can't be considered under the code because the code wasn't in place at the time where that incident occurred. So all of the information coming into the Commission from 1 December, including through mandatory reporting, can and will be considered in the context of code provisions. So what that means is be assured that all of the intelligence that we get through all of our various sources will be considered in the context of code provisions, but things that happened prior to 1 December, not able to because the code didn't exist at that time.
Okay, useful to clarify. Thank you. Michelle, I have another one for you that's come through in the course of the webinar. Will the code apply to, and there are a series of questions here, individuals working in aged care as independent contractors or students, or back of house staff such as finance and payroll? Do you want to take them in sequence? Independent contractors?
Thank you, Janet. Yes to independent contractors, yes to students, and I can't remember the other one, but yes to that as well.
Back of house staff, finance and payroll.
Yeah, look, I've got a bit of a comprehensive list here I can run through if you like, because it does help illuminate this a little bit. So it's intended the code will apply to people like executive management team, chief executive officer, board members, anyone responsible for day-to-day operation of the service, service and facility managers, those responsible for nursing services, allied health professionals contracted by the provider to provide care to consumers, kitchen, laundry, garden, maintenance and office personnel employed by the provider, support workers, personal care workers, lifestyle coordinators and care companions, service coordinators, case managers, consultants, trainers and advisors for regulatory support or systems improvement, independent contractors engaged by the provider, including some health professionals, volunteers of the provider who deliver care supports and services, and students falling under the category of people otherwise engaged by the employer. And a couple of quick examples of people who aren't intended to be subject to the code: visiting medical practitioners, pharmacists and allied health professionals who've been requested by or on behalf of the consumer but are not contracted to the provider, and tradespeople who perform work or otherwise than under the control of the provider. For example, someone visiting for a one-off maintenance type task. So it's a bit of a whirlwind tour, but that information is in the guidance that's available on the website.
Wonderful. Well done. Yes, it is quite a list, and I think everyone watching would want to go to that now, just to run your eye down it and make sure you understand fully what the scope of application is. Michelle, I'm going to stay with you. There's a really interesting question here about consumers. And the question is, are they being made aware of this new code? And what are our expectations as a commission about how they're being made aware? Now, I'm going to venture a couple of sentences to start the response. We of course, have our educational material, and I invite you to talk about that briefly. But there's also an expectation, an understanding indeed, that providers in the normal course of their engagement with consumers would be talking about this new obligation which attaches to providers, to aged care workers, to governing persons, and that it would be something which we would expect to come up in discussion, so that consumers were aware that this was a new provision applying to that range of individuals. A, is that correct? And B, what further do you have that you can add?
Thanks, Janet. Yes, look, consumers are obviously a vital cog in this wheel, and it's very important that they are aware of the code. And you know, part of the kind of fundamental aim of the code is to help those consumers gain trust and clarity around what they can expect from people delivering their aged care services. So we've got a range of both communication and education products that are being developed for consumers. Pretty much in the final stages of being drafted, the first lot of those. So I imagine that they'll be up on our website fairly soon. And also videos, fact sheets, discussions with consumer groups directly, including advocacy groups. So we are very keen to be raising awareness with the consumer group, and you know, as you've said, enlisting providers in making sure that happens as well.
Okay, good work. Katie, a couple for you, if I may. Will there be a database that all workers would need to be registered on, or is it only in relation to those who have been banned?
So, to start with, under the laws that have been passed, or through the registration of the subordinate legislation, which we will, the Minister will register before the 1st of December, the only information about the banning orders will be, the only information publicly would be banning orders for individuals, so that there won't be a registration system or database as such, just in relation to when the Commission makes a banning order in relation to an individual. Further down the track, it is anticipated the government has made a commitment to a registration scheme for personal care workers, and that we are working through what that would look like, what the elements of it would be, and how it would work at the moment. But at this point in time, it would just be a register of any individuals who have been banned.
All right. Thank you. I have another question for you. We've had references throughout about providers who deliver services for NDIS participants as well as for aged care consumers. And we've also clarified that there are subtle differences between the codes of conduct applying to each of those workforces. Katie, do you have any tips or observations to make about providers who find themselves delivering services to both those client groups, who therefore have workers who, at least notionally, might be operating under both codes simultaneously?
Yes, that is a possibility, and we know that some providers do provide services in both sectors. And many of the participants today would remember that the consultation, in fact, did look at a code that would cover all care and support sectors. Now, in the development of the code, at this point in time, the code will just focus on aged care. But you would have seen from the material that Michelle and Lisa have taken you through as well, is that the code for aged care is heavily based on the NDIS code, except for the small difference. And that's a more contemporary approach, you might say, to the sort of obligations that make up the code. So it will be a requirement for those services who are operating in both sectors to be conscious of that, but they are so similar that it shouldn't offer any barrier on a very practical level. And my tip would be for those services and providers in that space to operating in both spaces to familiarise themselves with the aged care code and to point out that difference and focus on raising awareness about that area of difference.
Michelle, back to you. Had a couple of questions around the same matter, which is relating to previous aged care workers. So an aged care worker who has worked at a particular place may have been the subject of an allegation of misconduct, but they're no longer working there. How does the code operate in that context?
Yeah, thanks, Janet. The code specifically, the legislation specifically refers to people previous aged care workers and governing persons. And the reason for that is really because it's quite a mobile workforce. People do drop in and out. And I don't think that we would be pursuing people who have been previous aged care workers and who no longer want to work in aged care. But where you want to come back in and work in aged care, then the code applies to you in the context of your previous conduct. And so we definitely are not wanting that situation that can arise where we're not able to take any action against someone because they cease to become an aged care worker. They quit and disappear off the scene for a bit. As I say, the legislation's been specifically written to make sure that it accounts for those situations where, someone wants to come back into aged care and we can look at their contract in a more holistic kind of fashion.
Yeah, okay. All right, another question, and it relates to the earlier conversation around advising consumers. Amy's come back with a really good supplementary question. Who's going to be responsible for that? Is the Commission going to send something to consumers, or is this something that we expect providers to do? And if so, is there a timetable? Let me go to the last of those questions first. There's no explicit timetable. There's a general understanding that a provider who is routinely engaging with their consumers as part of delivering care. So communicating with them, ensuring that the care is fit for purpose and that the consumer is being well served and so on. In the course of that normal interaction, we would expect there to be a conversation about the code as a new requirement which is applying to aged care providers, governing persons and aged care workers. But there's no timetable. In terms of what the Commission can do, we don't have an address list for every single consumer in the country, of whom there are 1.2, 1.3 million. So we are really reliant on providers to reach out to your consumers. As I said, there's no strict timetable. It doesn't have to happen in the first week after 1st of December. All we're doing is reasonably place upon you an expectation that in the course of time and without too much time elapsed, your consumers become aware of this new obligation. So, for example, and to create an extreme case to make the point, if in 12 months' time, if the beginning of December 2023, none of your consumers was aware there was a code, we'd probably have a few questions to ask of you. But we're not going to be unreasonable. We know you've got a lot on your plate, and we are seeing this as being communication that you would have with consumers in the course of your normal interactions with them, rather than something specific. Though, I would say that some of you may choose to be very deliberate and directed in the way you draw it to your consumers' attention. And if you want to take that approach, well done you. I think being direct about it would be a very useful idea. That brings us to the end of time for questions. There were a few more that we didn't get to. As I said earlier, we will be putting those in a Q&A section on our website, so keep an eye on that, please. Big thanks to Katie, Michelle and Lisa for their work on the panel. Further details on the Code of Conduct is available on the Department's website. We have our draft provider guidance now available on our website. Leading up to and beyond the 1st of December, we will be doing everything we can to support you and your workforce in relation to the code. You've already heard about the educational material, the resources, the various pieces of work that we are publishing and getting out to as quickly as we can. As reinforced today, providers have obligations to ensure that your governing persons and workers comply with the code. So we do appreciate your commitment to ensuring that they are aware of their obligations and they have the necessary information in order to comply. But as a number of speakers have said, this is not something novel. We're not introducing a whole new level of obligation. These things are already embedded in the aged care quality standards about which you know so much. So thank you in advance of your assistance also in ensuring that your workers are aware of the webinar we're holding on the 11th of November on how the Code of Conduct applies to aged care workers. Please keep an eye on our webpage so that you can register, or your workers can register for that 1 week in advance. We will be regularly posting information on the code, as I've said, and other major reforms. So visit our website often for updates. And if you're interested in things like the introduction of serious incident response scheme into home services and the strengthening of provider governance obligations, we have had and will continue to hold webinars on those, so keep an eye on that too. Keep an eye also on the Department's Aged Care Engagement Hub to find out how you can participate in various consultations that the Department is holding. And to close, if you haven't already done so, please participate in our feedback survey to give us your comments on the things that you enjoyed about this webinar, where you think we could do better, because we are very, very keen to hear from you. A recording of this webinar will be available soon on our website, and we hope to see you again in the near future at our next webinar in the sequence. Thank you everyone for paying attention and staying with us across the course of the hour. Good afternoon. Bye-bye.